Project Bluebird and Artichoke, how are they different from the MK Ultra?
Not that different. I mean, Bluebird was the first out of the box. This was the first CIA attempt to create a program that would somehow open up consciousness. I mean, it was an attempt to figure out what the Russians and the Chinese were doing during the Korean War, when our soldiers came back from the Korean War, who seemed to be suddenly had converted to communism, and were saying how bad the America was and how bad the capitalist system was, and that they shouldn't have been in Korea fighting the North Koreans, on and on. So there was this idea that somehow our soldiers, when they were captured by the Koreans, the North Koreans, and fell into Russian or possibly Chinese captivity, that there was some weird, Vulcan mind meld thing taking place, and they would come out of a relatively brief period of captivity making these bizarre statements attacking the United States. So this is where the term brainwashing came from. The whole concept of brainwashing started during the Korean War, when people became very aware that something very strange was happening, and the United States and the West in general became very concerned that maybe there was some type of program, some type of technique or technology that could actually change a person's consciousness completely and turn them into some kind of robot. So once people were aware of this, once CIA especially, because CIA was quite young at this point, CIA had been created in 1947, and now in 1950, 51, suddenly there's these concerns that there's a whole world of, how shall we say, a whole world of military technology of which they were not even aware of. That there was something going on that could, attack a person's mind and convert them, to another way of thinking. I mean, we had done this during World War II. Psychological warfare was nothing new. We had been using it to some effect during the war, so we knew that, you could change people's minds through advertising, basically, through, disinformation, through, dropping leaflets down on people, that sort of thing. But here was something much more specific. Here was, you take a human being and you hold on to them for a few weeks or a few months, and then suddenly they come out a completely different person. This was what, the intelligence agencies of the world were interested in. Is this possible? Can you, obviously it's possible because there was the evidence. There were American soldiers, denouncing the United States. So, what was going on? So Bluebird was the start of this. Bluebird was the first mind control project, if you will, that came out of the box for CIA. This was their initial foray into this. And it happened because of the Korean War. It happened because of what was happening to our prisoners. So Bluebird was the first. Bluebird perhaps the most famous because of the name, but it was really the first program. It started the CIA off on this program that would last 20, 30 years or more of trying to figure out how do you control the mind of another human being? How do you control its contents? How can you rearrange it? Can you delete memories completely? Can you replace them with different memories? Can you control the will of another person, of another human being?
What about Artichoke? What was it?
Just another iteration of the same thing.
Okay.
When Bluebird wound down, Artichoke took over. Artichoke, I think, was when Alan Dulles, head of the CIA, took a more active role, a more active interest in the mind control program. So they created something called Operation Artichoke, and then eventually that lasted for about a year or two, and then after that there was it became much more formalized, and it became the MK Ultra, that program that we know about. That was probably the granddaddy of them all. MK Ultra lasted well into the 1970s, as far as we can tell, and perhaps longer. they pulled the plug on MK Ultra during the Watergate fiasco, when there was a lot of investigation into what the government was doing to its citizens. I mean, Watergate kind of instigated that. And then there was the Rockefeller Commission, which was the commission that was designed to figure out what the CIA was up to, what it had been doing. Was it a rogue agency? That's when Richard Helms was in charge. So Richard Helms, when the Congress started looking a little bit too closely at CIA and its programs, Richard Helms decided to shred all of the documentation on MK Ultra, Bluebird, Artichoke, everything, and shredded all of the documentation except for 4 boxes of accounting records that everybody had forgotten about. That was sort of in the basement over there at Langley at CIA headquarters, and it took a researcher called John Marks who heard something about these 4 boxes, and he got access to them. And it's those 4 boxes of accounting documents that are the only MK Ultra documents that have survived. And it's not a lot, but what it did do is it showed the extent of the program. It gave operational names, program names. It gave sort of a breakdown on what was happening with these various programs. It's by no means the detailed records that we would love to have, but it actually proved the existence of MK Ultra, Bluebird, Artichoke, Operation Often, and some of the other programs that were taking place under this umbrella. And it was the smoking gun. It said, okay, here we have all these programs. Trying to find out, what people were affected by this, what human beings were affected. It's been very difficult. Obviously, the names of people that were experimented upon, particularly prisoners, are gone. They've been erased. We don't know who they were. We have an idea of some of the prisons where some of the experimentation took place, because the CIA would use violent criminals, violent offenders, as the guinea pigs in their research. So we had some idea of what prisons they were using. We don't know what prisoners. So there's a whole world of information that we don't know.
What prisons, for example, were they using?
Well, these were usually pretty high security federal prisons. They had to be, federal prisons as part of the federal prison system was that which was most, amenable to being controlled by a federal government agency like CIA. So you're talking federal government prisons, federal prisons all over the country, in Ohio, in California, just dotted all over the landscape.
Wow.
So Kentucky was one side. I mean, we had federal prisons everywhere that were part of the system. So we don't know the true extent. We don't know every prison that was being used either, because that information is gone. We just have indications of some of the prisons. And at the same time, I should point out, we're talking about the CIA programs, but running parallel to that, there was the American military running its own programs. So the Army had its own mind control programs as well. And that's a different story, because now you're using soldiers. Some of them totally unwitting. I mean, they did not know they were being used as guinea pigs. So you had one famous case of a soldier who was dosed with LSD in very large doses, didn't know what was going on, and the military simply observed his reactions over a period of time as the soldier became increasingly paranoid, and then they tried to have him discharged on mental grounds of instability or something. I mean, they had created the problem, and then they tried to sweep it under the rug by saying, well, the guy was crazy, he didn't know, he was an unstable person, and on and on and on. So you had a lot of nasty stuff going on. You had a lot of guinea pigs that were being used that didn't know what was going on. In the case of the prisoners, they were given massive doses of LSD, and these were people who were violent offenders, violent sex offenders in some cases, violent offenders in general, given all of this stuff, not told what was going on, and just observed. And then the program is suddenly terminated, the documentation is destroyed, and now we have who knows how many prisoners who are now loose in the system, who've had all this terrible stuff done to them, and now they're out on the street. right? So we don't know how many of these people were affected, how many we've created. We know that, for instance, the Unabomber was part of one of the mind control projects, a voluntary member while he was at Harvard. But we just have bits and pieces. We don't know precisely. There's a very good chance that Charles Manson might have been one of the people who was part of the program. There's a good chance that Henry Lee Lucas, the famous serial killer, was at one of the prisons when this was going on. So there's a lot of possibility that some of our famous criminals were actually beneficiaries, if you will, of these programs without even knowing it, without even being aware of it.
My gosh. Well, you heard about the mass shooting in Colorado recently.
Absolutely. Well, I don't know what to say about that yet because we don't have all the documentation, but we do know that he studied neuroscience.
Yes.
We do know that he was, involved in that type of research. We don't know the details. We don't know what his specialty was. We don't know if he was a voluntary or involuntary member of some program. In fact, we really don't know today, to be honest, if these programs still exist.
Yeah.
CIA has insisted since the 1970s that the programs were stopped in the 60s and that they no longer existed. CIA didn't find them very useful, so all of these programs were terminated. That's the official story we've been given by CIA.
Yeah.
We don't know.
We believe them.
Well, obviously there's a problem of credibility here.
Yeah.
Particularly when the head of CIA himself is shredding documents in his office. We don't know what the extent of that, of that program, is. We don't know if it really existed through the 70s, if it exists today. We're not going to know. There's just not going to be any definitive answer to that. And plus, we also have to realize the military was conducting its own studies. The military is pretty much answerable to no one where that's concerned. They're answerable to some extent to Congress, but military intelligence takes a pretty high priority. And if they are still running programs like that, we may never know. Or we may not know until 20 or 30 years later, until there's a whistleblower who comes out and says this is what they've been doing. It's a big temptation to use this type of research. It's a big temptation to use this technology because CIA may have said it didn't work, but I don't believe it. CIA, for instance, says, well, no, you can't give a person false memories. And yet former members of the CIA's own programs have created, a false memory foundation in which they insist that, evil psychiatrists are planting false memories about satanic abuse. So you can't have it both ways. I mean, either you can plant false memories or you can't.
Right.
Which is it? I mean, you can't say on one time, that, these programs didn't work, we were not able to successfully do it, and then have psychiatrists who worked for your program, go on and, claim that false memories are being implanted. So obviously, if false memories can be implanted, if people can be made to believe they've experienced things they have not experienced, then I believe the CIA programs were working. But they did find out how to do that. And, today in the news in the last couple of months, one of the prime candidates for that has always been, in my mind, Sirhan Sirhan, the alleged assassin of Robert F. Kennedy. There was, a new report recently that trial may be, that case may be reopened because of new information. I would love to see that. I think that's the one case where we have so much evidence that there was a kind of mind control program going on and taking place that we really should go and reopen that case and look at it, knowing now today what we know that we didn't really know then. I think it's worthwhile looking into it. There's definitely indications that Sirhan, number one, did not fire the fatal shot, and number two, that there was a mind control program in operation at the time.
Wow. Oh, my goodness. What is cybernetics? And who founded that?
All right. Well, cybernetics, we're going back a ways. We're going back again into the same period of time as the CIA program started. I mean, cybernetics is a word that came into usage in the 1950s. And the idea was to create, I don't want to use the word mind control loosely because it's used a lot too loosely, but cybernetics was a way of looking at consciousness as if it was a machine that could be programmed, that could be regulated. It was a very popular concept, and people were fascinated by this idea that you could approach your own mind creatively and proactively, so to speak, constructively, that you were not simply the victim of your consciousness, but that your consciousness could be directly approached, and you could make adjustments to your mind. You could control it. You could control your thinking. You could control your reactions, your emotional reactions. So this was all part of the buzzwords that were, was happening in the 50s and the early 60s. You heard a lot about cybernetics then. I was a kid at the time, but the books of cybernetics was a very popular book, a New York Times bestseller for a long time. People were, enamored of this idea that you could take an active approach to your own mind. This was really an outgrowth of what CIA was trying to do all along. CIA believed that the human mind was malleable. They proved this. I mean, they had a program up in Montreal run by Dr. Ewan Cameron, who was the president of the World Psychiatric Association for a while. I mean, he was the leading shrink in the world for a time, and he was on CIA payroll. He ran CIA mind control operations out of his laboratory in Montreal. And his technique took cybernetics, to its logical conclusion, basically. What Cameron did was he had systems called de-patterning, where he would take a person who had just shown up for something simple, like maybe they wanted to quit smoking or something, and he would get a hold of them and pretty much against their will and against their knowledge would basically erase as much of their memory as possible. Really erase it. I mean, under very controlled conditions, using the kind of techniques that they used in Korea and they used later in Vietnam and in other places where they would incessantly, basically mentally torture you with sleep deprivation, with sensory deprivation, with loud noises, with chanting, electronic recordings that would never stop, with microphones under your pillow giving you suggestions as you were trying to sleep or as you were sleeping, all sorts of things, basically to drive you insane, to erase your personality completely, and then slowly, in a system he called repatterning, then slowly build up the kind of consciousness the psychiatrist wanted. So basically changing your personality from the ground up, erasing everything in your conscious memory, and then building things in your unconscious memory and trying to rebuild you as a human being. And he experimented gleefully on patients for years in a system that was very abruptly stopped. According to Gordon Thomas, if his narrative is to be believed, Thomas, who's a historian about mostly Israeli intelligence, that sort of thing, but he did also write about MK Ultra. And Gordon Thomas mentions this one scene in Montreal on November 22nd, 1963, as they're watching with horror the assassination of President Kennedy on television. Ewan Cameron's CIA handler is there, and after the assassination takes place, he turns around to Cameron and he says, "By the way, your project has just been terminated." I mean, the timing is very suggestive. So suddenly Cameron is running the CIA op where he's, brainwashing people essentially and sending his reports on to the CIA of how successful he's been in erasing memories and rebuilding personalities. At the moment of the assassination, his project is terminated. I mean, there's this there's this horrifying sense that, you know, Oswald, you know, was a candidate for this. Oswald has been, you know, part of this, or somebody involved in that circle around the Kennedy assassination. Part of it was part of a mind control apparatus. So it's all very suggestive stuff. And the funny thing is that Thomas does not make that connection in his book.
Oh my goodness.
He just simply says it happened to be like coincidentally Cameron lost his funding on that day. You know, but I look at it from a different point of view entirely. Like, well, we're successful. We've got to, you know, shred the documents now. Thank you very much. So I don't know. You know, that was all part of all of that. I mean, cybernetics was the positive spin they put on this idea that you can, you know, proactively change your entire brain, you know, using various kinds of techniques. So it was very much, you know, part of the buzzword, very much part of the, you know, the fun stuff that was taking place. You know, a little later we had things like "I'm okay, you're okay."
Yeah.
You know, a lot of pop psych books, you know, happened after that, as well as pop, you know, management books like the Peter Principle, you know, and Parkinson's Law. And these are all things that, you know, on the management level, you know, were analysis of how you ran organizations. You know, the mentality of organization, mentality of corporations on the one hand, and on the other hand, you have pop psychology books telling us how we could change our ways of thinking and change our minds and change our consciousness. So you had this idea that we could, if we just had the right toolbox, we could go in and fix everything at the deepest possible layers. You know, Freud talked about interpreting dreams, and Jung was talking about interpreting dreams and doing depth psychology and depth analysis. And then suddenly you had the pop guys come along, you know, writing about cybernetics and writing about, you know, pop psychology, saying, oh, you know, it doesn't take much. We can do this ourselves. You know, so all of the things that used to be part of religion and part of spirituality suddenly became part of technology. You know, became part of what technicians would do. So you had these science fiction horror stories, you know. You had these images of technicians, you know, plugging you up to a machine and, you know, changing your mind completely, you know, changing your consciousness, creating a different person, lobotomizing you, but doing it from, you know, a kind of non-invasive technology approach. You know, all this other stuff that we were fascinated with the Cold War. You know, we had Cardinal Mindszenty, a famous Polish cardinal, during Stalin's show trials during the Cold War, go on television basically and say, yes, you know, we were all guilty, you know, we did horrible things, you know, basically doing what the American soldiers in Korea were doing, making a complete turnaround, and suddenly taking responsibility for things for which, of course, they were never responsible. So, you know, Mindszenty suddenly became this icon of what, you know, Russian brainwashing techniques could do. They could turn you into a kind of mindless robot. So it started with that, and this idea that the government could change you and make you into a mindless robot became morphed into this spate of books and this spate of ideas saying, well, you could change yourself into a mindless robot. You know, you could do it on your own. You know, we don't need the government to do it.
Oh my gosh. What about L. Ron Hubbard and Dianetics?
Well, you know, that came out of a different background, but still, you know, some of the same players. I mean, Hubbard had been a naval officer during World War II, who did not cover himself with glory during that period. I mean, his military record's been declassified, and it's been out, it's been published. We can read, you know, what the military had to say about Hubbard, which was not very flattering. The guy seemed to have been starting to suffer a nervous breakdown while he was in the Navy. And he evidently tried to commit suicide at one point. We don't know all the details. He was in hospital for, they say, for ulcers. I don't know what really he was in the hospital for, but as he's coming out of the hospital, he befriends some science fiction authors. Hubbard was interested in writing science fiction, which, to my mind, that's all he ever did. And he befriended some science fiction people who met up in Pasadena, in California, which included Jack Whiteside Parsons, John Whiteside Parsons,
Yeah.
Jack Parsons, rocket scientist, one of the founders of the Jet Propulsion Lab, a genius rocket scientist, and who was also a member of Aleister Crowley's OTO, the Ordo Templi Orientis, a secret society, a magical order that was operating in California at the time. Parsons, the head of the order in California at that moment, befriended Hubbard, thought Hubbard was a great guy. They got on very well together. They performed ritual magic together.
Yeah.
From Parsons, Hubbard learned a great deal about Aleister Crowley, a famous British magician. He learned a lot about ceremonial magic. He learned a lot about occultism in general. And then basically stole, Parsons' girlfriend stole his money, went to Miami, absconded with all of this. Parsons went to at least retrieve some of it, was successful partially, but Parsons went back to California alone. Hubbard married Parsons' girlfriend, even though he was already married to someone else.
Yeah.
Took the money, and within a year or two had created something called Dianetics, which was, again, a way of changing your own brain, changing your own mentality, becoming clear in Scientology jargon.
Yeah.
Hubbard created Scientology, and in the first few years of Scientology, in the first few years of Hubbard giving his speeches and giving his talks, he would talk about Aleister Crowley in a very personal way, as if he had met Crowley, which was impossible. Crowley had died in 1947, at the time when Parsons was out in the desert with Hubbard, doing all these rituals. Hubbard claimed to have known Crowley. Hubbard claimed that Crowley taught him, everything he knew, talked in a very positive way about Crowley, until at some point somebody, I guess, told him to shut up, and the Aleister Crowley narrative dropped from the overall history of Scientology. But that's part of the history you cannot ignore. Hubbard got his mind control type training, if not from the Navy, then from Jack Parsons, from ceremonial magic, from all of the stuff that really gave rise to Mormonism, previously, that Joseph Smith was involved with. The same types of techniques, the same rituals and ceremonial magic that inspired Joseph Smith and essentially helped to create Mormonism were the same rituals that helped to create Scientology. So they both have a common origin. These are two quintessentially American movements that had their origins in ceremonial magic and in some of the same books and some of the same rituals. And so you have, L. Ron Hubbard and Scientology coming from that same background. So Dianetics is essentially the same thing. You try to go back into your unconscious mind and neutralize all of the conditioning that you've gone through since birth or before birth. I mean, the Scientology curriculum is very ambitious. And you start by, going to bad experiences you've had, and you neutralize them, and you neutralize all sorts of emotions until finally you've attained the state of being clear, which means you have no reactive body. You no longer react unconsciously to what's taking place around you. You no longer have instinctual or reactive expressions. So people cannot make you angry. They cannot do things to you that your reactive body responds to. It's hard to kind of explain in a few words or less, but basically you're in control. You're in complete, total, utter control of your consciousness. Nobody can elicit an emotional response from you that you do not consciously create. So you create your own reality completely. All programming is wiped. But that's not the end. Once you've attained clear, then there's all sorts of other, levels of clear, like theta clear, and you can go beyond that to other levels where, you become part of this great space opera that Hubbard really wanted to write, because he was really a science fiction author. So he was, writing about different planets and different, ancient histories of the world, and he was writing about conflicts that are taking place on the world, and it's all very, science fiction-y, of course. He wrote science fiction. He wrote books about Scientology, it's quite hard to tell them apart sometimes. So the higher levels of Scientology, are involved in all of the space opera stuff. So, and then for an organization that prided itself on being clear, you had the space, the Sea Org group, which were people that were going out and, trying to find Hubbard's enemies and destroy them, and find enemies of Scientology and destroy them. And it was a very noxious organization that lasted for quite some time. And you had, Scientologists breaking into FBI offices trying to get their files, and you had all sorts of skullduggery taking place with Scientology. So it became, as an organization, it kind of looked to me like it was being reactive and was not totally clear. They would get totally crazy if somebody ever criticized them, and they would go after people to destroy them.
Yeah, and I have heard once you're in Scientology and you have children, they arrange it so you can't leave the organization. And if you do choose to leave, they'll fix it so you can't take your children.
Well, there have been testimony to that effect. People have come forward and said that, former members of Scientology, that they could not get their children out. That people would leave or try to leave. Of course, they strongly suggest you don't leave. I mean, there's a lot of strong arming that takes place there.
Yeah.
And if you want to leave, it's because you're not clear. The programming hasn't worked. You have to come back and get some more programming or deprogramming or whatever they want to call it. They have a different word for it. They use e-meters, which are supposed to be emotional response meters, similar to lie detectors, which they hook up to you to see if you're still responding emotionally to anything, which means, of course, you're still in the grips of someone else's evil programming instead of their evil programming.
Yeah.
So, so anyway, there's this whole process. And yes, I mean, people have come forward and said that, and Scientology has hotly denied it, but there seems to be evidence that that's what happens, and it's consistent with other groups like that, like People's Temple, the Jim Jones, operation, or a lot of other groups like that have done that. They use children against you. They try to hold on to the children. If there's a couple with a child, with one member of the couple wants to leave, pretty much they can fight for custody for the child with the remaining spouse, with the remaining parent, rather.
Yeah.
So it becomes a legal nightmare. And we have now the interesting case of course, the famous one of Katie Holmes and Tom Cruise, where Katie managed to get her child out when she left Tom and left Scientology just recently. So, and she seems to have done it using disposable cell phones and all sorts of stuff. So she knew what she was up against. In order to get her child out, in order to escape. So
I don't mean to interrupt, but we're having one heck of a thunder and lightning storm. So if I lose you, we'll try to hook up again.
No problem.
Okay. Well, I have heard that in Scientology it is expensive.
Oh, sure. It's extremely expensive. It's like buying a car.
Yeah.
In order to get clear, it costs about that much money. So it is a money-making machine.
Yeah.
I mean, that's what it's for. That's what it does. So, and one of the things that we may lose sight of with the whole Tom Cruise, Katie Holmes situation is one very important part of Scientology, and that is they target celebrities. It's part of their operation since the beginning, since they first started. The idea was the more celebrities they can attract, the higher profile they become, and the more profile they have, they'll be able to rake in that many more quote-unquote regular people, non-celebrities, who are really going to be paying for the whole system. So they make their money and they gain their wealth on the backs of the average person who comes in, and it's kind of a pyramid sales scheme in a sense. I mean, and I'm not saying that legally necessarily, but in a sense it is. They bring a person in, and they tell the person, and they test the person up front. The test usually will show that you have some serious emotional or mental defect that only Scientology can solve. That's how the process works. So you take a standard sort of psychological test, about 100 questions or so, and then the information is fed into a computer of some kind. They graph it out, and then you're taken into another room. And in this room, you have one of these robotic people who doesn't make eye contact, who sort of sits across the table from you with your report and says, okay, you're obviously on the verge of suicide or something, and only we can help you. You've got to sign up for our auditing sessions. It's called auditing and not, psychoanalysis. And in the auditing sessions, this is where the e-meters come in, and they show you, see, you're reacting emotionally to all of this, and that's not you, that's your reactive body that's doing this. This is what you've been programmed since birth. We have to deprogram you. We have to take away all of these reactions. And as all of this is taking place, it takes place over a long period of time, months to years, and you have to pay for this constantly. So you're constantly paying. And at some point, the only way you can, afford to keep doing this is if you start to bring in other people who are going to become audited, who are going to pay for all of this as well. So you become part of the machine. It's not specifically set up as a pyramid scheme, because you just become part of the system, and more people are brought in, and there's really no indication of how many you're bringing in. You don't personally make any money from this. Only Scientology does.
Right.
So you're not becoming wealthy. In a pyramid scheme, you become wealthy at the expense of people that you're bringing in, because you're getting a cut. In Scientology, we don't know. There doesn't seem to be an indication that that's taking place, because everything you have goes to Scientology. So the Scientology organization is making the money, like the People's Temple was becoming enriched by basically the welfare checks of people they've brought in. So it's a different approach, but it should also be illegal from my point of view, but that's another story. But people are brought in. They're paying upwards of $10,000 to $20,000 to get clear. But again, that's not the end of the story. There's a lot more money after that, because there's different levels. And you don't just get clear and say to Scientology, gee, guys, thanks a lot, I'm out of here. It doesn't work that way. Once you're in, you're in. So there's a lot of Scientology stuff that goes on. Now, they've created what they call the Church of Scientology, and that was a tax dodge, and we all know it was a tax dodge.
Right.
There's nothing ecclesiastical about Scientology. But, they call it the Church of Scientology, and that's what helps them to maintain a non-profit status. But the idea of a church didn't happen initially. Scientology was started initially as a psychological program. I mean, that's how Hubbard envisioned it.
Yeah.
Hubbard envisioned this thing as a psychotherapeutic technique. It was not supposed to be a church. It became a church later when, for legal reasons, they decided to incorporate that way, and also to give Hubbard some kind of cover, because there were all sorts of lawsuits that were taking place. The government was investigating him, and for a while he had to live on his boat at sea, because he couldn't actually land anywhere without getting arrested.
Oh my goodness.
So, and that meant anywhere. I mean, Europe was refusing him, his boat to dock there, or else they had warrants for his arrest. I mean, whoever the United States had reciprocal relationships with, he could have been arrested in a lot of countries around the world. So he had to live at sea, and because he was at sea constantly, we have the creation of the Sea Organization, the Sea Org. These are the people designed to protect Hubbard, protect Scientology, and go after Scientology's enemies. It grew out of this phenomenon of Hubbard sitting on a boat, afraid to dock anywhere because he could be arrested. So there's a whole host of issues that comes up with this. There's a whole bunch of First Amendment issues, Second Amendment issues. I mean, was Scientology a church? Was Hubbard being victimized, because of his religious beliefs, which is how they wanted to portray it, which is nonsense, but anyway, that's the way they want to portray it. So they had some legal grounds there. Was it right for the government to go after Hubbard as viciously, as they seem to have done, as deliberately as they seem to have done? So that's for lawyers and constitutional lawyers, some years down the pike to mull over. But for me, from my point of view, the Hubbard organization was frightening,
Yeah.
quite frankly. I saw it as a frightening organization. And, you know, I don't know. I mean, they broke into the FBI's file to see what the FBI was doing, what kind of surveillance they were doing on Scientology, what kind of records they were developing on Scientology. Now, these days, looking with, for the benefit of hindsight, we're living in, the second decade of the 21st century. We've gone through all sorts of rights violations. We've gone through all sorts of privacy incursions by our government.
Mm-hmm.
You kind of develop a sense of sympathy, thinking to yourself, wouldn't you like to get hands on your own FBI documents?
Yeah.
Wouldn't you like to see what the government's collecting on you? So you do come up with a sense of sympathy these days, saying to yourself, well, damn, we all would like to know what's going on there. We all would like to know what files are being collected on us. We would all like to know what the government is saying about us behind our back. I mean, we would all like to know, why some of us get on an airplane and are pulled off for special screening, How did that start, That's been done to me, I was on that list for, I don't know, maybe about a year or so. No explanation given as to why I was on it. No explanation as to why I was taken off. So, we would all love to know how that started. I mean, that's not paranoia. That's simple human curiosity. So, do we trust our government at this point to always be doing the right things?
No.
And there's a lot of, they have to build a lot of goodwill with us, to do that. And right now, the only goodwill they're showing us is saying, well, we haven't been attacked since 9/11, so thank your lucky stars and thank us because we're on the job.
Yeah, because they haven't attacked us again.
Right. Because they're protecting us from the guy with the bomb in his shoe and the guy with the bomb in his underwear.
Right.
They're the ones, although the guy with the bomb in his underwear was pretty much walked onto the plane, it looks like, by some kind of intelligence officials. I mean, the whole thing is a mystery to me. So, I mean, I know how hard it is, because I've traveled a lot. I've traveled a great deal over the last 20, 30 years or so. I know how hard it is to get on a plane without identification, especially after 9/11.
Yeah.
So how our Nigerian friend was able to do that beats the hell out of me. I mean, I really don't understand how he was able to do that, but that's another story. So, do we trust our government? In the wake of Watergate, in the wake of Iran-gate, in the wake of all the other things that have gone on, with the government, in the wake of all this stuff that's been happening, and wiretapping citizens, and looking at our library books, that sort of thing. In the wake of all of that, how much trust do we have? I mean, it's a two-way street. Government has to trust you to a certain extent as well, and they basically don't trust any of us. I mean, there is no trust. We're all potential terrorists. We're all potential evildoers. So we have to then develop this mindset, of turning that back on government and saying, well, we don't really particularly trust you either. So we need to know what you're doing and why you're doing it. And unfortunately, our fifth estate is not doing a good job of this. I mean, we don't have a media that's really proactive anymore. We don't have a media that's really digging into what's going on. They're pretty much just reprinting press releases, and and if you do question, well, then you're part of the lunatic fringe.
Yeah.
So we've gotten to that point. We've gotten to that very, black and white, situation where the mainstream media, which basically repeats press releases and just repeats what they've been told by the government is on the one side, and they're the forces of light, and people who question all of that are the forces of darkness. They're the conspiracy theorists. No matter how reasoned your approach is, no matter if you're basing your criticisms on actual documentation, on actual interviews with people. I mean, where does WikiLeaks fit into this division, the mainstream media and the lunatic fringe? The government would have you believe the WikiLeaks people are evil and they're conspiracy theorists that are on the lunatic side. Obviously, they're not. They're just printing documents that come into their possession. And the documents reveal the skullduggery that goes on. So, we don't have people anymore who are taking that information and using it as part of investigative journalism. You know,
Right.
they're treating these documentations like they're toxic,
Yeah.
and no one's doing the investigation.
Yeah.
You know, only the conspiracy theorists are, and that's where we've gotten to. So our consciousness has been manipulated. You know, we have been given this alternate narrative of the world, and it is working in a lot of cases. You know, the psychological warfare programs, you know, which morphed into Madison Avenue,
Yeah.
which morphed into the advertising campaigns of the 1950s, 1960s, and 70s, which grew out of psychological warfare because the people who created Psy-War during World War II then moved to Madison Avenue and created the advertising, you know, phenomenon.
Right.
These are the same individuals with the same training. You know, they realized that if you can manipulate the enemy into believing you're the good guy, you can take that same technology and make us buy a Chevrolet, you know, make us buy Arrow shirts and Chesterfield cigarettes. Remember those?
Yeah.
And you know, they can manipulate the consciousness of the American consumer. And what are we, you know, these days watching the media, but simply consumers of prepackaged, freeze-dried, fast food news.
Yeah.
You know, this is what we've become. So to go outside that box is to be dangerous. It's to look out to the area, you know, where monsters dwell. We're not supposed to go out there. You know, we're supposed to stay nice and comfortable within the physical limits of the United States, because they're making it very hard to leave the country. So you've got to be within the physical limits of the United States, and you've got to be within the psychological limits of the United States.
Mm-hmm.
You cannot watch foreign news. You know, you cannot watch BBC. Not that BBC is much better, but it is to an extent a little bit better than CNN, for instance. You can't watch the foreign news. You can't read the foreign press. Don't speak any foreign languages. Don't be exposed. You know, everything is, quote unquote, under control. So, you know, we started this conversation with talking about Bluebird and Artichoke and MK Ultra, but the programs have changed to an extent. They have really transformed. They've evolved over time. So it's almost archaic to talk about the mind control efforts of the 1950s and 60s,
Right.
because the mind control now is all around us.
Oh, yeah.
It's institutionalized. It's part of the program.
They've saturated us with it. Peter, what, in your opinion, is the difference between a psychopath and a sociopath?
Well, I think we talked about this last time, and there's a technical difference, but quite often, you know, in the field, people will use the two terms interchangeably. Socio, of course, comes from the word for social, sociology, and you know, society. So path is pathology, it's sickness. A sociopath is someone who is a danger to society. They're a person who does not adhere to the social norms that we believe that we do. A sociopath, for instance, one of the definitions is they feel no guilt. Now, guilt is an emotion that is pretty much necessary for the functioning of society, at least from the point of view of psychologists.
Yeah.
It's guilt that stops you from harming your fellow human being.
Mm-hmm.
It's this idea that it's wrong to do that, or it's the fear of being punished, or something like that. The internalized guilt, which, by the way, is what Scientology wants to make sure you don't have.
Yeah.
They want to rid of this guilty reaction formation. You know, they want to make sure you don't feel guilt, that everything that you do is conscious and deliberate, and therefore you shouldn't feel guilt, which, you know, basically means that Scientology creates sociopaths, but that's another story.
Yeah.
So the sociopath feels no guilt, and a sociopath and a psychopath, psycho, of course, means psychology, psyche. A psychopath has something wrong with the functioning of their brain, with the functioning of, not the organic brain necessarily, the functioning of their consciousness. There's something wrong with that. Psychopathology could be a lot of things. You could be hearing voices, you could be seeing visions, you could be doing things that, you know, that are obviously psychological illnesses, and that's a psychopath. But we sometimes use the term to mean somebody who is so ill, so sick, that they turn that sickness on their fellow human beings and try to hurt them or destroy them.
You mean like what's going on in Washington?
Well, see, it's really a question as to is it sociopaths or psychopaths that we're dealing with in Washington. I think that would be an interesting study that somebody should, maybe Congress should authorize a multi-million-dollar study is just to determine if they are psychopaths or sociopaths.
You and I should do that study.
Yeah, I think so. And I think they should authorize some number of funds. They should budget us for this. And
yes.
We'll report annually for the next 10 years on our findings.
Yeah.
Well, they obviously don't feel guilty.
Right.
You don't see any Congress people, any senators or representatives coming forward and saying, you know, we're really screwing up. We really feel bad about this. There is no sense of guilt in Washington. So I guess you could say sociopath already is pretty good. And then there are some programs that basically target Americans, and again, they don't feel guilty. That probably fits into the psychopath. I mean, they are hearing voices, some of them.
Oh, yes.
We've had presidents who talk to God. So, you know, that's on the psychotic scheme of things, I think, you know.
Yeah. Oh, boy. Well, this brings up another issue. Not guilty by reason of insanity. Insanity is not a clinical term. So what do they mean by that in a courtroom?
Yeah. Insanity means not able to tell the difference between right and wrong. So when you've committed a specific crime, you're not morally responsible or legally responsible for having committed that crime because at that moment you did not know the difference between right and wrong. You were not living in the same world as the rest of us.
Oh, that perfectly describes Congress.
Does it?
Oh, my goodness.
Well, it comes from the word sano, which means, the Latin root, which means healthy. So if you're insane, you're not healthy.
Yeah.
And it's a legal term that says not healthy. I mean, there is no clinical term because insanity is not recognized by psychiatry because psychiatry breaks down different types of mental states and mental illnesses by very specific names. So you could have, you know, you could be a paranoid schizophrenic or whatever. They break it down this way. So you have to be very specific in psychiatry and psychology as to what type of mental disorder you have.
Mm-hmm.
But in legal terms, they just say, well, you had a mental disorder, and that specific mental disorder meant you didn't know that what you were doing was wrong. You thought you were doing the right thing. You thought that what you were doing was good, even though what you were doing was bad.
Yeah.
So that came out of something called the McNaughton Rule, which goes back more than 100 years, in which a guy tried to kill the Prime Minister of England. Missed, shot somebody else, as it turned out. But that's not to the point. He was arrested, and because I think he was from Scotland, he was going to kill the English Prime Minister because he felt that England was enslaving his people and oppressing his people. So he left the Prime Minister's carriage and fired into the carriage and killed an assistant rather than the Prime Minister. But the point was this was the first case of something called not guilty by reason of insanity, the McNaughton Rule, named after McNaughton.
Mm-hmm.
And this is how we enshrined this concept of not guilty by reason of insanity. And it was based upon a political assassination. And that's something that I point out in Sinister Forces. There is this connection between political assassination and insanity that we use constantly because we believe in this famous, meme of the crazed lone gunman.
Yeah.
McNaughton had to be insane because he attacked the head of state. By definition, if you try to kill the head of state, you must be crazy. The government essentially, or the power structure, has so defined sanity and insanity, consciousness, insanity, and political assassination as this thing where anybody must be crazy to go up against the government. They've instilled this idea that if you're anti-government, you must be insane. You must be crazy.
Yeah.
And this is, I think, what we've come to expect. Oswald, the crazed lone gunman. Sirhan, the crazed lone gunman. They're all crazed lone gunmen, right? They all operated alone. There was no conspiracy. Don't look here, nothing to see. There was not more than one. There was only one person. The person was obviously deranged. End of story. Don't look any further.
Right.
Don't stop to consider that maybe that gunman, that maybe that assassin, wrong as it is, legally or morally, to kill another human being, wrong as that may be, maybe his reasoning was sound. We don't want to admit that the reasoning was sound, that the action was wrong, the action was evil, the action was criminal, but the reasoning behind it was sound. England for sure was oppressing the Scottish people,
right.
you know, which is why Scotland has constantly wanted their independence. There's no question, but in order to deflect everyone's attention from that major issue, they focus on the poor assassin himself and say, the poor guy was just crazy.
Yeah.
You know, he's obviously deranged. If they had just executed him and said, yes, you're responsible for your actions, then they make him a martyr to the Scottish cause. Then they give legitimacy to the Scottish cause. So by calling him crazy, by extension, all of Scotland was insane. You see, so they just stopped the discussion right there. It's over. No need to discuss this any further. And it has worked beautifully since then.
Peter?
Yes.
Oh, I thought the line disconnected. Yeah, and that defense is used a lot. And many of the people that benefit by that just walk out of the courtroom free.
Or they wind up in a mental institution for a period of time until somebody says, okay, you're cured now.
Yeah. Yeah. Well,
so, I mean, that's the other side of it. So, you know, there's an alternative to this, and that is pleading guilty.
Yeah.
Now, that's been done in a number of cases where, for instance, in the Son of Sam case, the famous serial killer murder spree that was taking place in New York City in the 1970s, which we know now, I think beyond any reasonable doubt, was the activity of a cult operating in New York. But at the time, David Berkowitz was arrested for the crime. He pled guilty immediately, so there was no trial.
Yeah.
And because there was no trial, we never found out what was going on. Berkowitz was sentenced to life imprisonment for all of those crimes, for all of the murders. He's still in prison to this day. And yet he has gone back and said, okay, I didn't commit all the crimes. I did kill some people. I didn't kill all of them. And here's the ones I didn't kill. And the ones I didn't kill were killed by members of the same cult to which I belonged.
Yeah.
You know, and he comes out and he gives names, and, you know, basically gives all that background information. And so they have to reopen the case in New York, which they did kind of quietly a few years ago. We don't know the extent of that. I've talked to the people who were involved in the original Son of Sam case, who are convinced they know all the details about the operation of that cult. They have the names. They know what went on. And yet they were hounded off the police force once they started agitating for a greater investigation into this group. And now they're scattered around the country, and basically they're out of contact with the investigation. No one's talking to them. And I'm appalled at this state of affairs. But this is what's been going on. So pleading guilty is the other option. Berkowitz pled guilty. This way there would be no trial. Now, I don't know if he pled guilty because his lawyers told him to do that, which I find difficult to believe, or because the group he belonged to told him he had to do that in order to protect them, right?
Oh,
so he did that, and he remained silent for a long time. It was only maybe 10 years after his sentencing that he started to talk. So, you know, we have that other option, the pleading guilty option, you know. So you have the not guilty by reason of insanity option, and you have the not guilty, which means there will be no trial, nothing will come out, which is pretty much the same as pleading, you know, not guilty by reason of insanity. So either way, we never find out the truth. That's at the heart of both of these strategies. We will never find out what really happened. Everything will be buried. You know, with Oswald, with Sirhan, with all of these characters, you know, we were told there was no conspiracy. There never was a conspiracy. We don't have conspiracies in the United States. That takes place in other countries. You know, other people are assassinated because of conspiracies because their political systems are so bad. But because our political system is so good, we have no conspiracies.
Yeah.
There was no conspiracy. I mean, Abraham Lincoln was killed as a result of a conspiracy. We know that. We hung the co-conspirators.
Yes.
A bunch of, there's photographs, look it up, right? We know that Abraham Lincoln was the victim of a conspiracy. But for some reason, since the Civil War, there has never been a conspiracy to kill an elected official. There's never been a conspiracy to kill a president since Lincoln. Lincoln was the last one, right? So what did we learn from that story? We learned something from that Lincoln conspiracy case that made us say, okay, from now on, no conspiracy. No conspiracy. Ixnay on the conspiracy. There will never be another conspiracy. It'll never happen. No matter how much data, everybody is wrong-headed. We can explain away the data. No conspiracy. And if you believe in a conspiracy, you are a conspiracy theorist. Ipso facto, you're insane.
Yeah.
So that's what it comes down to.
Well, this brings up another issue, madness. In 1969, there was an incident on May 13th where 6,000 Malaysians, 90% were ethnic Chinese. They were left homeless by the end of the savagery that took place. And that's when they realized that madness took over. They ran amok.
That's right. Well, it's a very complex story. I lived in Malaysia for 7 years. So I lived with that story as a living history for a long time. To give your listeners just a very brief background, what happened was Malaysia got its independence from Great Britain at the end of World War II. They instituted a sort of parliamentary form of government. The majority of people living in Malaysia at that time were Malay, ethnic Malay people, and predominantly Muslim. But it was a very slim majority, maybe 55% to, according to some estimates, 60%, but that's been questioned. I would say 55%. I'm comfortable with that number. 55% were Malay and mostly Muslim Malay, 55%. Then you had a large Chinese, ethnic Chinese population of perhaps more than 30%. And then you had a large ethnic Indian population, which took up the balance of that figure. So, and then you had certain indigenous groups as well that had been there since the Stone Age practically. So it's a very multicultural country, which is one of its fascinations. If tourists who go there, people passing through, remark on the fact that it's just a melange of, Malays and Chinese and Indians, and they're all living there. They have their own, cuisine. They have their restaurants. They have. It's a very vibrant kind of lifestyle. But at the same time, right underneath that vibrant lifestyle, there's a lot of ethnic animosity. Part of it's based on religion. Muslims against the Chinese Buddhists and the Christians and the Indian Hindus. So you have, religious groups. There are at least 4 that are in conflict. You have the ethnic tensions, which are based on race. Racial Indians versus racial Malays versus racial Chinese. There's linguistic differences. So there's a lot of problems, social problems built into that country, to that context. Now, the Malays have always been rather nervous about the Chinese presence in the country because they are such a strong majority. There's a lot of Chinese. Some Chinese control the economy. It's believed that if you look at Malaysia, the Malays control the government because that's predominantly a Malay bailiwick, but the Chinese control the economy. So you have this tension between these two forces. So in 1969, there was an election, and the Chinese political party won a seat. They won a minor kind of electoral victory, defeating a Malay candidate. So they were happy.
Yeah.
They went on a spontaneous kind of parade with their flags waving to say, we won this democratic election fair and square. We got our seat. We got our candidate elected. And they're marching, in Kuala Lumpur, the capital of Malaysia. And the Malays went, quote unquote, amok. Now, amok, A-M-O-K, is a Malay word, by the way. We get that word from the Malay language. Amok is a momentary state of madness, of violent madness that takes place, which seems to be, something quintessentially Malaysian, I guess. You go amok, you go nuts, you take out your parang, you take out your large sort of machete, and you go running around trying to kill people.
Yeah.
That was the cover story for what happened. We had cases of plainclothes Malay people with knives, these long sort of machete-like knives, falling upon this parade and hacking people to bits as the military and as the police basically stayed out of it, looked on. The conflict began in one of the kampungs in Kuala Lumpur. It's a kampung is a kind of community, like a neighborhood or a barrio in the Spanish sense. And it was a predominantly Malay Muslim group. They were incensed over the fact that the Chinese had won. They organized themselves and ran out and began burning Chinese shops, destroying Chinese homes, and basically killing Chinese, as many as you said, 6,000 is one of the estimates of people that have been killed, many more left homeless, the shops destroyed. This was what took place, and it took place for days. I've spoken to people who lived through it. It was a very horrifying time. You had to just go and hide and hope that no one saw you.
Yeah.
If you were Chinese, if you were on the street, you ran for cover. You hoped that somebody would let you in, Malay, Chinese, Indian, whatever, and would hide you as these rampaging mobs went through the streets, attacking anyone or anything who was Chinese. Now, the point of this story is that the government, the Malaysian government, then investigating this case, prosecuted no one.
No.
They used the excuse that the people had gone amok, that they went temporarily insane, and were not responsible for their actions. That was the story. Documentation that has been released since that time, declassified documentation that's been released since that time, puts the lie to that. We know that this was an organized thing. We know that it started very consciously, very deliberately. We know which kampung it began, and we know who the ringleaders were of it. We know how the military and the police stayed out of it and did not protect the Chinese from this.
Yeah.
Because the idea is there's just too damn many Chinese in our country, and this is one way of, population control, right?
Oh.
So they stayed out of it, and they basically punished the Chinese for winning an election, and they did it by using not guilty by reason of insanity. This is the time when the government used it for itself.
Oh my gosh.
So the government said, our people were momentarily insane. They can't be held accountable. End of story. They used the Monotony rule to defend themselves, which, by the way, is kind of what the government did in the case of the Kennedy assassinations and Martin Luther King and all the rest of it. Was, the government saying, these people were insane. These people were nuts. There was no conspiracy. They were crazed lone gunmen. Well, in the Malaysian case, of course, there was not one person. It was a group that was crazed. There were no lone gunmen. It was just crazed, knife-wielding assassins. And there were thousands of them. So what does the government do? They say, well, they were all momentarily insane. There was no attempt to psychoanalyze any of these perpetrators. The perpetrators were not identified. They were not taken to a psychiatrist for any kind of examination. There was just a pronouncement, a pronunciamento from, the head of government saying, well, they were just amok. They ran amok. We Malaysians do that every once in a while. We go crazy. Sorry, they're not guilty. It was a case of mass hysteria, mass madness. It only lasted a few days. Then it was over. Everybody came to their senses. Gee, we're sorry, but, Now, that has been used, however, quite deliberately in the Malaysian parliament. Every time the Chinese raise an issue concerning their second-class citizenship status in that country,
yeah,
every time that's raised, somebody in Parliament, one of the Malaysian politicians, will go up in Parliament and say, remember 1969, the threat to the Chinese. Don't try to exert yourself. Don't try to put yourself forward. Do not be aggressive in our country, because remember what happened the last time. In other words, the threat is constantly there. The threat is constantly made. Now, the Chinese who are living in Malaysia have been there for more than 200 years.
Yeah.
They date back a very long time. So those people who live there, the Chinese who live in Malaysia, consider themselves Malaysians. They are Malaysians. Their culture is Malaysian. You know, they identify themselves. They self-identify themselves as members of that country. But legally in Malaysia, they've long been considered second-class citizens.
Yeah.
You're only a first-class citizen if you are a Malay, ethnically Malay. What they call you Bumi Putra, which means you're a son of the soil. You sort of sprouted from the earth, you know, and that's a real Malay. You get special privileges. If you're Chinese or Indian, you're not Bumi Putra. You haven't come from that soil. You came from someone else's soil, and therefore you don't have the same rights and privileges as a Malay. And that's a legal institution, and that's institutionalized in the law. And every time the Chinese object to it, they're slapped down. So this is the situation. We're talking about this because of the idea of insanity and of the way the term has been used by governments to hide the truth about things that take place. They're using consciousness technology, consciousness terminology to hide behind when legal wrongdoing has taken place.
Yeah. Oh. Well, that kind of goes along with the Myanmar religious cleansing that's going on. The Buddhists there are escalating genocidal massacres against the, how do you pronounce it, Peter?
The Rohingya.
Rohingya Muslims. And those Muslims have lived in this land for 800 years, and they have no status at all.
Well, it's a very, again, a very complicated question also. Myanmar, as we all know, has been under military rule for a very long time.
Yeah.
This is the country that's given us Aung Suu Kyi, and, you know, the Nobel Prize-winning lady who was under house arrest for decades because she was in opposition to the generals who ran the country. So you have a very volatile political situation, and people are looking for scapegoats.
Mm-hmm.
The Rohingya are Muslim, for the most part. They occupy a section of Myanmar, what we used to call Burma, which we may go back to calling Burma, I suppose, in the western part of that country.
Mm-hmm.
It's believed that they came to Burma from what is now Bangladesh, that they are ethnically more Indian than they are Burmese.
Yeah.
Although they speak Burmese and they've lived in Burma for a very long time, like the Chinese in Malaysia, the Indians in Malaysia.
Yeah.
But they still have they're still Muslim, and Burma is predominantly Buddhist.
Yeah.
And the antagonists in this, the ones who are persecuting the Rohingya, are claiming that it's not on religious grounds, that they are against the Rohingya because of ethnic grounds. They say these people are not really Burmese, and they should go back to their country because they're disrupting the apple cart here. They threaten the polity, of the place. They're threatening the stability because of their ethnicity. Somehow, magically, because they're of a different ethnicity, they're a threat to the government. But also because they're a threat to the economy. They believe that they are, the way we're treating the undocumented aliens, the illegal immigrants in our own country. For instance, Mexicans who lived in, the United States also for hundreds of years are being, racially profiled.
Yeah.
They're being, gone after aggressively that way. And they're using all sorts of legal arguments to do that. Well, the same thing is happening with the Rohingya. They're in this questionable legal state suddenly.
Well, how can that be when they have lived in Burma for 800 years?
Well, There are so many examples of this around the world, I don't know where to begin. We can take Palestine as an example.
Yes.
We can talk about what's going on in many parts of Africa as an example. We can talk about things taking place in Latin America. I mean, this idea, you know, just because they've lived there for 800 years doesn't make you a citizen, man.
Yeah.
It's this kind of attitude that we have. It's whoever has the power determines, you know, who's a citizen.
Yeah.
That's what's going on in Malaysia, right? Even today. So the Chinese have lived there for 200 years, so they're not citizens. The Indians have been there for just as long, and they're not citizens. You know, not complete citizens. They don't have the same rights. How is that possible? And every time, as an example, when the Malaysian government, you know, says, okay, your ancestors had to have lived here since this year, they put a year in the past in order to be full citizens.
Yeah.
Every time the Chinese reach that point, the Malaysian government has another vote, and they push that year back further.
Oh.
So they've been doing this and doing this. I mean, this is that strategy.
Oh,
So
my gosh.
leave it to the Burmese will probably do something like that as well. They will say to the Rohingya, you're not Bumiputra, you know, you're not sons of the soil. And because of that, you know, you're not a citizen. This is nationalism of an extreme sort that we saw, and I'm sorry to make this parallel because it's maybe overworn and overdone, but it's the same strategy that was used in Germany in the 1930s.
Yes, yes.
The Jewish people who were born and raised and lived in Germany for hundreds of years were suddenly declared no longer citizens. They were not Bumiputra. They were not sons of the soil. Their origins were somewhere else. So since your origins were somewhere else, you're no longer a citizen of Germany. That is ultra-nationalism. That's nationalism taken to its logical conclusion. But you've got to be, you know, your blood has to have come from that earth, as if such a thing ever happened in the history of the world. You have to actually say that, you know, in order to be a citizen, you have to have come from there. That means everyone in the United States will have to leave.
Yeah.
Right? If we take that to it, well, everyone, including the Native Americans, quote unquote, because they might have been there first, but they sure as hell didn't come from North and South America. Right? They came across the land bridge from Asia. So the Native Americans have got to go back to Siberia, and the rest of us have got to go back to Africa, Europe, wherever we came from, Asia, and then leave the country empty. Because according to that rationale, that's what you'd have to do in order to create citizenship. There would be no citizens in North or South America, for that matter. The entire Western Hemisphere would have to be emptied of its people if we were to accept those laws. I mean, that's just, you know, where do you stop? So the Rohingya, yes, they've lived in what is now Burma for a long time. And Burma was occupied territory by various colonial powers for a long time. And the Japanese had invaded. And, you know, the same thing happened in Indonesia. You know, there's a Chinese minority population, a very small minority in Indonesia that was singled out for persecution for a while long after the colonial powers had left. One good thing about the colonial powers, and probably the only good thing, is that their presence pretty much meant that ethnic conflicts would not be allowed to continue, right?
Yeah.
So you had that in Yugoslavia, when there was a Yugoslavia. You had, you know, foreign powers in Eastern Europe controlling those situations. And then you had Tito in Yugoslavia, you know, the strong man, holding together the Serbs and the Croats and the Bosnians and everybody else under an iron rule. And, of course, Tito was a monster. He was a dictator and a monster. But once he was gone, there was no longer rule of law. Then all of the ethnic groups started shooting each other. And these rivalries that went back hundreds and hundreds of years, religious and ethnic rivalries, then came back to the surface, you know, and were manipulated, you know, cynically by other powers. The Nazis manipulated those rivalries during World War II. They used the Croats against the Serbs. They used the Bosnians against the Serbs. You know, so there was this, you know, people manipulated them. So when the colonial powers left, other people did the manipulating. And now you have this situation in Burma. You have Muslims being persecuted by Buddhists. You know, we in the West have this rosy view of Buddhism, you know. Buddhists don't kill people, you know. Buddhists don't do violent things. Buddhists are nice people. They believe in love and peace and in nonviolence, ahimsa, and, you know, all of these ideas that, you know, every person has the Buddha nature within them. You know, you don't even kill animals or insects or anything because of the danger. You know, there could be There could be a karmic debt involved. You could be, eating your uncle, something.
Yeah.
So there's all these ideas that we have about Buddhism in the West, and now we look at Burma, and we see that Burmese can be just as vicious. And we have Muslims who are being victimized, as Muslims were victimized in the former Yugoslavia, which we forget. Muslims are being ethnically cleansed
Yes.
in the former Yugoslavia, and now they're being ethnically cleansed in Myanmar, Burma. So we have to pay attention to this, because all the religion in the world, all the spiritual teaching in the world falls apart when it comes down to these ethnic rivalries.
Yeah.
These ethnic hatreds come out, and it doesn't matter where you went to church. You're going to take up your gun, or you're going to take up your sword, or your knife, or your machete, and you're going to go amok. And that's what's going to happen. And we've got to understand this phenomenon. We've got to do what we can. And I hope that Aung Suu Kyi is there in Burma taking note of what's happening to the Rohingya, and will at least stop the violence. If she cannot change people's minds about them, at least do what she can to make sure the violence is stopped, so everybody can sit down calmly and discuss the situation.
Oh, Peter, it just upsets me so much, this kind of thing. What's going on in Palestine and Burma, and just so much of it in the world. And, people would think, well, we learned our lesson with Nazi Germany. Oh, really? Oh, my gosh.
Well, we haven't. And, the Rohingya is just one example of what's taking place around the world. You don't have to be Buddhist, you don't have to be Muslim, you don't have to be Christian to be persecuted, you don't have to be Jewish to be persecuted. You can be any of those things. And depending upon which country you're living in, you will be persecuted. So it's a question of all people of all religious faiths, if they really truly have religious faith, have to get together and say, okay, this is absolutely wrong.
Yeah.
We can't kill Muslims because, well, basically we don't want Muslims killing us, do we? I mean, there can't be a religious excuse for this. There cannot be. I don't know what religion has an excuse for this. So we've got to stop and think, and when Buddhists are out there killing people, man, we know there's something really wrong with the world here. There's something really out of whack.
Yeah.
That we have to come back and say, wait a minute, hold on. What's happening?
Well, it upset me so bad. I blogged about it on my new blog, about this business of the Rohingya being slaughtered. It just, since June 28th, 650 of the Rohingya have been killed.
Right, and there's been much more than that over the years. The attempt is to push them back to Bangladesh. It's believed that they are ethnic Bangladeshis.
Well, Bangladesh won't accept them either.
Right, that's the problem. Even if they wanted to go back, Bangladesh is saying these are Burmese citizens. These are not our people, quote unquote. Which is pretty funny, since there was no Bangladesh really until 30, 40 years ago.
Yeah.
That's a whole other story. Part of the ridiculousness, part of the absurdity of all of this, of course, is that Bangladesh used to be part of Pakistan, which used to be part of India, going back, thousands of years. It got split after independence in 47 when the British were kicked out. Mahatma Gandhi and all of that. So then Pakistan wanted to separate because they were predominantly Muslim in that part of the Indian subcontinent. But then there's a whole other Muslim pocket over where Bangladesh is today. So that was East Pakistan, and there was West Pakistan. And then later, East Pakistan became Bangladesh. Now Bangladesh is saying to the Rohingya, well, you're not Bangladeshis. Well, shit, nobody was Bangladeshi back in 1947. There was no such thing. So let's get reasonable, people. Let's try to define our terms here a little bit better. But anyway, all of that aside, and not to belittle the situation, these people are in serious trouble.
Yes.
Someone's got to stand up for them.
Yes.
Someone's got to give them some kind of citizenship somewhere. Otherwise, they are going to slowly disappear, either through violence or through attrition. This entire culture will disappear. So I'm praying that the Burmese government and its newly enlightened state we'll do something about this in a positive way and protect the rights of these people, regardless of the animosities that may have gone back for hundreds of years, regardless if the Rohingya, I don't know, 200 years ago victimized some of their Burmese brothers and sisters, or who knows the history. I'm not going to pretend to be intimate with all those details. I don't think you can be unless you're Burmese.
Yeah.
So, all of that aside, the violence has to stop before anything constructive can take place. So at least stop the violence and figure out something that's going to work where more people don't get killed, regardless of who's at fault and regardless of who's pointing fingers. I mean, we can say the same thing about Israel and Palestine.
Yeah.
We can say the same thing about almost anywhere on this planet right now. Just stop killing each other. Figure out how to make this work. Figure out something that everybody's going to agree with. And that's what you have to do.
I say amen to that, Peter. Oh my goodness.
Yeah.
Oh my goodness. Well,
we get too distracted by trying to place blame.
Yes.
We get too distracted by saying your great grandfather stabbed my great grandfather. 100 years ago. We're too distracted by this. This is nonsense. We have got to stop. We are not our great grandfathers. We have to take responsibility for ourselves today, where we are, and not blame our actions on somebody else that died hundreds of years ago. We have got to stop. We just have to. We have to take immediate responsibility for immediate actions, and people just don't want to do that. They want to go back to, what your great-grandfather did to my great-grandfather. And it's just, that's not going to work. We all know it's not going to work.
Well,
we're being manipulated. Our consciousness
absolutely
is being manipulated by people who are very clever at manipulating media, at manipulating a message. And we've got to just defend ourselves against that.
That's right. Well, Saudi Arabia is considering purchasing nuclear weapons from Pakistan. I just fell over when I read that article. Oh, my goodness. What are they afraid of?
Well, if I was Saudi Arabia, I'd be afraid of Pakistan, quite frankly.
Yeah.
But, I would be afraid of almost everybody in the region if I'm a Saudi. But, Saudi Arabia has its enemies. Osama bin Laden very famously hated Saudi Arabia because they had allowed, the foreign troops on the sacred soil of Saudi Arabia. They didn't allow them into Mecca or Medina. They just allowed them where Kuwait is, on the border to push Saddam Hussein back. But that didn't matter. There were foreign soldiers on the sacred soil of Saudi Arabia, so therefore the Saudi royalty, the Saudi kings were at fault, and, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So, once again, we're going back to ancient rivalries and ancient hatreds. But if we start, scratching at that scab, we're going to find all sorts of ancient tribal animosities, even within Saudi, especially within Saudi Arabia. And, of course, we have different Islamic sects within Saudi Arabia. And the Wahhabis right now are in charge, but that wasn't always the case. So you have a complicated situation there. I think the Saudis are nervous. They may be nervous about Iran. If Iran is getting nuclear weapons and the Saudis want nuclear weapons, then everybody in that region wants nuclear weapons. I'm sure Kuwait wants nuclear weapons. I'm sure Bahrain and Qatar, they all want nuclear weapons at that point. Well, really, right? Wouldn't you? I mean, if you lived in that area and, Ahmadinejad had his finger on the button, you'd want a lot of your own buttons,
Yeah.
So, that's just the way it's going to go. It's going to escalate into that kind of stupid thing that we saw happen during the Cold War, when everybody bought so many nuclear weapons that there was one or two, warheads for every person on the planet, literally. So we've got to get out of that mindset, but of course we're not going to. We're dealing with people who are just coming into that mindset for the first time, and it's exhilarating, and they're not about to let it go. So, the Middle East has always been problematic.
Yes.
It's been problematic for over 1,000 years. And it's going to continue to be that way. We don't have really good Arabists anymore in the State Department. They all went away when the Bush administration came in, so we don't have people who really understand the region the way we used to.
Yeah.
We have a handful of specialists, and they're spread very, very thin. The FBI has so few people who speak not only Arabic, I mean, there's nobody speaking Urdu or Pashto or any of the other regional languages, in order to understand, to deconstruct all of the chatter that comes in. I mean, we are totally hamstrung when it comes to intelligence gathering in that region because we've relied too long on electric intelligence, ELINT, onto satellites and phone taps and that sort of thing. We don't have people on the ground. We don't have specialists in the area who can tell us how to fine-tune a situation.
Right.
We're simply focused on threat analysis, without actually going to the root of those threats, without understanding the anti-colonialism of the area, which is very important to understanding the point of view of the people living in the developing countries, that they've just shaken off hundreds of years of colonialism. They can't be expected to understand the world the same way we do. So there's a lot that we have to understand about their histories before we can understand the threats and where the threats are coming from. And we just don't seem willing or able to do that.
Well, it's a mystery. Oh, Peter, thank you so much for the time that you spend with us. And everybody